Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into a case that is, well, it's one of the most significant and deeply unsettling criminal cases in recent Irish history, and it's really three different stories woven together.
That really is.
At its heart, you have the tragic murder of Elaine O'Hara in 2012. It's a crime that's just rooted in this dark, premeditated sadism.
And then you have the second story, which is the investigation itself. It's incredibly complex, and it was solved. I mean, not with a smoking gun, but almost entirely with circumstantial evidence found in the most unbelievable ways.
And that leads to the third story, which is maybe the most critical one for everyone listening.
Ah.
It's the story of a landmark legal battle that ended up challenging the very foundations of data privacy, not just in Ireland, but across the entire European Union. We are, of course, talking about the murder of Elaine O'Hara by the architect Graham Dwyer. Our mission for you today is, I think, very clear. First, we have to unpack the tragic timeline of events to understand Elaine O'Hara's life and the chilling details of the relationship that led to her murder. But the deepest dive is into that third story. We really need to grasp the profound legal implications of the mobile phone metadata that was used to convict him, and why that very evidence sparked a decade-long war over our digital rights.
And it is absolutely essential that we approach this entire deep dive with the respect and sensitivity it demands. I mean, Elaine O'Hara was the victim of a shocking, calculated crime. Before we get into the mechanics of the investigation or the legal precedent, we really must focus on her life, her context, and the immense human suffering at the heart of this case. The technology and the law, they all follow her tragedy.
So let's begin there with Elaine O'Hara herself. She was born in 1976, and what the sources show is a life that was defined by, genuine goals, especially professionally, but also just tragically interwoven with some significant personal struggles.
That's right. She was educated at St. Joseph of Cluny Secondary School in Dublin. She was a dedicated childcare worker in Ballybrack, and she had this clear professional ambition. She was taking night classes in Dunlaghair, working towards her goal of becoming a Montessori teacher.
So she was clearly focused, dedicated to working with children.
Yes, very much so. It really speaks to a caring individual. But that dedication, as you said, it existed alongside some very profound personal struggles.
Right.
The sources document that she had a history of being bullied at school, which seems to have unfortunately laid a foundation for some of her struggles later in life.
Yeah.
She grappled with mental health issues from her teens, really. Things like depression and borderline personality disorder.
And that diagnosis came from a very well-respected psychiatrist, Professor Anthony Clare.
It did. And these struggles, they weren't minor. They necessitated regular psychiatric hospitalizations throughout her adult life.
And the sources also point to some specific events, some very specific moments that really destabilized her support system.
Exactly. Two events are highlighted as major setbacks. The first, and maybe the most damaging, was the death of her mother in 2002. Losing that foundational support clearly made her more vulnerable. And then the second, 5 years later in 2007, was the sudden death of Professor Clare himself.
The psychiatrist she relied on.
Her primary professional caregiver. For someone who relies on that stable, trusted psychiatric relationship, losing that person so suddenly,
yeah,
it must have been a huge destabilizing blow. And on top of that, she was also managing chronic physical conditions like asthma and diabetes and dyslexia. So her life was layered with difficulties that she was actively trying to manage.
So that gives us a picture of a dedicated but clearly very vulnerable woman living in step-aside. Now let's turn to the circumstances of her disappearance on August 22nd, 2012. They were confusing, to say the least.
Well, when she first went missing, the initial police assessment was based on what they knew about her activities. She was a volunteer, and the tall ships races were on at the time.
Right.
So there was an early sort of tentative theory that maybe she disappeared while volunteering there, but that idea was very quickly replaced by a more immediate, darker concern.
What was it about the scene at her home that just didn't add up?
When the Gardaí looked at her flat, they found things that suggested she hadn't just left voluntarily or planned to travel far. Her main things, her bag, her purse, and crucially, her main everyday mobile phone, they were all left behind.
Which you would, you would take those things with you.
Of course, someone planning to travel or start a new life, they would take those essential items. But the surveillance footage, that's what made it even more complicated. It introduced this mystery of a second phone.
A second phone.
Precisely. Security footage showed her leaving her home, but she was carrying a different phone. This detail was absolutely critical.
Why? What did that suggest?
It meant she was either planning for some kind of interaction or a separation from her usual life, where she needed to stay in touch but without using the phone her family and friends knew about. It suggested either deliberation on her part or, tragically, a planned meeting that separated her from her normal identity.
And what do we know about her final movements that day? The ones that led everyone to assume it was suicide.
Well, her final sightings placed her in Shangana Park, which is just south of Shankill. It was established that she went to Shangana Cemetery, which is where her mother was buried. A witness later came forward who reported hearing a woman, fitting Elaine's general description, crying very, very loudly beside an old grave.
So she was clearly in a state of intense emotional distress.
Absolutely. And then her car was found abandoned nearby. So when investigators put all the pieces together, the location of the car, her documented psychological history, the fact she'd recently been released from a psychiatric facility after expressing suicidal thoughts, and the obvious distress at the cemetery.
The conclusion seemed logical at the time.
It was a tragically logical conclusion for both the police and her family. They assumed she had taken her own life, maybe by jumping from the nearby cliffs.
Yeah.
And for over a year, that was the accepted story of her disappearance.
The fact that suicide was the main theory for 13 months, it just shows how carefully the killer tried to stage the whole thing. And that assumption, it might have held up forever, if not for, well, a completely random act of nature.
This is where the story just shifts dramatically, and it's all down to environmental chance. The key event happens at the Vartree Reservoir near Roundwood in County Wicklow, over a year after Elaine disappeared.
We always talk about evidence, but here, the lack of water was the thing that revealed the evidence. How bad was the drought?
The summer of 2013 was incredibly hot and dry for a long time, and it caused the water level in the reservoir to just plummet. The spot where the evidence was found, near a bridge, would normally be under 15 to 20 feet of water, completely hidden.
But because of the drought.
Because of the drought, the water was only about 12 to 18 inches deep. It exposed the reservoir bed.
And so what did the anglers, William Fegan and his friends, see in that exposed mud?
On September 10th, 2013, so more than a year after she vanished, these anglers spotted a bag lying there in the shallow water. And the contents of that bag were the first absolute proof that this was not a simple suicide.
What was inside?
They found some very disturbing items: handcuffs, a ball gag, various restraints, leg restraints, along with some clothing. These items immediately pointed towards a violent sexual interaction, something linked to the BDSM subculture, an element that was completely unknown to her family or the police.
So that discovery immediately turns this from a missing person case into a potential homicide investigation.
Immediately. And that prompted a formal search by the Garda. On September 16th, that search turned up even more critical items: more handcuffs, a leather mask, a knife, an inhaler, which turned out to be Elaine's, and a chain with a keyring on it.
Was there an immediate, undeniable link to Elaine O'Hara in that find?
Yes. And it was a tiny and seemingly insignificant detail that was absolutely crucial. Attached to that keyring was a Dunn Stores loyalty card.
And they could trace that.
Investigators were able to trace that loyalty card directly back to Elaine O'Hara. This was the concrete link between all that disturbing sexual paraphernalia and the missing woman. It proved she was connected to these events. And then the Garda Water Unit followed up with more intensive searches. On September 17th, and then again in October, they recovered 2 Nokia mobile phones, 2 phone batteries, a rucksack, and a pair of glasses and sunglasses.
And the glasses.
The prescription for the glasses was a perfect match to her optical records from a Specsavers in Dunloghair. These phones, which had been hidden for over a year, would become the absolute cornerstone of the prosecution's case.
It's just incredible how that physical evidence came to light piece by piece in just 1 week in September 2013. And this all happened, the bag, the loyalty card, just 3 days before her remains were found.
The timing is harrowing, yes. Her remains were discovered on Killicky Mountain in the foothills of the Dublin Mountains. And similar to the reservoir find, the discovery was completely dependent on another random and deeply unsettling event involving a local resident.
Tell us about the dog trainer.
A local dog trainer, Magali Vernier. She regularly washed dogs on wooded land near Killicky. And she noticed that one of her dogs started this pattern of repeatedly running off during their walks and coming back with bones. This started around August 2013.
At first, she thought they were animal bones.
Of course. Given the location, you would. But on September 13th, 2013, the very same week as the reservoir search, the dog brought back bones that were accompanied by fragments of clothing.
And that raised the alarm.
It did. When she, the landowner, went back to the area, they found scattered and gnawed human bones, including parts of a rib cage and a jawbone. It was clear the remains had been exposed to the elements and to angles for a very long time.
That detail, the scattered and gnawed remain, it just underscores the violence and how much time had passed.
It's deeply upsetting. Because of the exposure and the time that had passed, only about 65% of her skeleton was ever recovered. She was positively identified through her dental records. And the location of the body, so remote, so concealed, it was completely consistent with what the killer must have intended, to make sure that if the body was ever found, it would just reinforce the initial theory of suicide.
So once the forensic evidence confirmed it was a murder, the investigation shifted from what happened to who was responsible. The police had the items from the reservoir, and they had these two burner phones. The critical step was connecting the victim to a perpetrator.
And that connection came through her digital life. Police dug into Elaine O'Hara's internet history. They found that back in late 2007, she'd set up a profile on alt.com, which is a fetish and adult sex website.
And what was her profile name?
She used the name Help Me Learn 36F. But crucially, digital records show she had viewed the profile of a man called Architect 72.
Architect 72.
And that profile was linked back to a Gmail address, Fetish Boy. And through those digital breadcrumbs, the police were led directly to Graham Dwyer, a married architect living in Fox Rock.
And that link immediately uncovered this hidden, intense, and very dark relationship, something that completely contradicted Dwyer's public image.
Absolutely. The investigation revealed they'd had this intense and violent sexual relationship that started around 2008. The activity involved extreme bondage, violence, the use of knives. Investigators later recovered violent homemade sex videos and email fragments from their laptops, which documented the extreme nature of their interactions.
But the relationship wasn't continuous, was it? The crime happened after they had separated for a while.
That's right. The relationship had sort of faded after 2008, but it started up again in March 2011 when Dwyer made a very deliberate decision to contact her again using a prepaid burner mobile phone.
And that's where these two specific phones come into play.
Yes. This renewed contact led to them using two specific prepaid phones, an 083 number that Dwyer used, and an 086 number O'Hara used. Both were reserved exclusively for their communications. It was the data from those two phones, the ones he tried to hide in the reservoir, that would ultimately seal his conviction.
Let's talk about those phones and the messages. The texts they recovered are the most explicit evidence of premeditated violence. This isn't just fantasy. This is a clear expression of a murderous desire.
They are chilling, and they document a very clear escalation towards lethal violence. In the messages from the 083 phone, Dwyer called himself master and O'Hara his slave, and he used that dynamic to express these violent urges.
Can you share the details of those specific texts that the prosecution used to establish his intent?
One text from June 2011 stated it plainly. It said, "I want to stick my knife in flesh while I am sexually aroused. I would like to stab a girl to death sometime."
The language is so specific, it's not vague at all.
No, it details a specific physical action linked directly to sexual arousal and lethal outcome. Another text from 2011, it pushed the responsibility onto O'Hara. It said, "My urge to rape, stab, or kill is huge. You have to help me control or satisfy it."
So he was coercing her into this.
He was establishing this pattern of communication where he expressed this dangerous desire and then tried to manipulate her into becoming the target for it. Retrieving those messages from the phones he tried to destroy, that formed the entire narrative backbone for the prosecution.
The public image of Graham Dwyer compared to these texts is it's staggering. He was the picture of suburban success.
He really was. Graham Dwyer was born in County Cork, moved to Dublin to study architecture. Professionally, he was very accomplished. A director at a prominent firm, A&D Weidgert and Partners, involved in major projects like the Carlow Institute of Technology and Leopardstown Racecourse.
And personally.
Married, lived in a comfortable home in Fox Rock, had children. His hobbies, flying radio-controlled aircraft, luxury cars, it all painted this picture of a stable, successful, middle-aged professional man.
But the investigation found two massive cracks in that facade: financial problems and a long history of violent fantasy.
That's correct. Beneath that surface of success, he was under intense financial pressure. During his interviews with the Gardaí, he admitted he was deeply in debt. He blamed it on the 2007 financial crash. His wife had lost her job, and his salary, while still high, had been cut severely down to €70,000 by 2011, which was half of what he'd been earning just a couple of years earlier.
And the violent fantasies weren't new either. They went way back.
They did. This was deep-rooted. A former partner, Amber McShay, she gave testimony that revealed that as far back as 1996, Dwyer had told her about a fantasy of stabbing a woman during sex. She even testified that he brought a kitchen knife into their bedroom and pretended to stab her.
So this wasn't just a sudden development linked to Elaine O'Hara.
No, this was a long-standing fixation.
So now we get to the core of the investigation, the metadata. The text provided the motive, but it was the mobile phone data that gave them the undeniable proof of the timing and the location of the murder. This technical evidence is really what convinced the jury.
This is the absolute center of the deep dive. The mobile phone companies had retained the metadata, as they were required to by law, for both the victim's burner phone and the killer's burner phone, as well as his main phone.
And to be clear, metadata isn't the content of the calls.
No, it's the traffic data. Who called whom, when, and most importantly, which cell phone mast or cell site the phone was connecting with at any given moment. That data painted a minute-by-minute timeline that the killer simply could not refute.
So how exactly did that cell site data prove the timeline of the murder and the cover-up?
The cell site analysis proved three critical things. First, it showed that Dwyer's personal phone and the two burner phones were often in the same geographic area at the same time, even though Dwyer denied owning the burner phone. Second, the data showed the 086 phone, the one Elaine O'Hara was carrying, traveled from her home in Stepaside on August 22, 2012, to the area of Killicky Mountain, which is that remote spot where her body was found.
Okay.
But here is the most damning technical part. The 086 phone was stationary on Killicky Mountain for a period of time. Then, the metadata shows that the same phone, the one that belonged to Elaine, traveled down the mountain towards the Vartry Reservoir where the phones were eventually found.
So the phone itself was moving after she couldn't have been moving it.
Exactly. The phone's location data stopped communicating with the mast shortly after it reached the reservoir. It proved that the phone traveled from the murder scene to the concealment scene after Elaine O'Hara had died, proving that the person who hid the phones was the same person who had been with her on Killicky Mountain.
It proved he was at both locations, the murder site and the disposal site.
It did. It proved two distinct movements carried out by the killer. This sequence, which suicide could never explain, turned all that circumstantial evidence into compelling proof of premeditation and staging.
So the trial opens in January 2015, and it becomes this huge media event. Let's get into the courtroom battle between the defense and the prosecution.
The defense, led by Remy Farrell, they had a massive challenge, but they focused very intensely on creating procedural doubt. Farrell argued there was a gaping chasm in the prosecution's case because, due to the condition of her remains, no pathologist could definitively say what the cause of death was.
No cause of death, no proof of murder.
That was the argument. If they couldn't prove how she died, Farrell argued, they couldn't definitively prove it was murder. And their main counter-argument was to shift the focus right back to that initial theory of suicide.
Right, leaning on her psychiatric history.
Heavily. They argued her history of suicidal thoughts, and her recent release from the hospital made suicide a plausible explanation. And the violent texts, Farrell maintained, were just evidence of sexual fantasy within the BDSM lifestyle that they both shared, not proof of criminal intent.
So the prosecution, led by Sean Guerin, had to use those exact same materials to argue the opposite, that this was calculated murder, not a fantasy gone wrong. How did they do that?
Guerin built this case of cold, manipulative planning. He argued that Dwyer exploited Elaine's known low self-esteem to manipulate her into a situation she didn't truly want. And he tackled the BDSM defense head-on by using O'Hara's own words against Dwyer.
What do you mean?
They referenced texts where she had expressed her wishes not to be stabbed or not to be beaten, proving she was not a willing participant in lethal violence. Guerin argued she was looking for companionship, maybe love, but she was coerced into satisfying Dwyer's extreme, murderous urges.
And the cover-up was key for them.
Absolutely. The prosecution argued that Dwyer lured her out, killed her on the mountain, and then intentionally staged the entire thing to rely on her psychiatric history as a cover. Hiding the phones and her personal effects in the reservoir was the definitive proof of his intent to commit murder and then erase all evidence of their relationship.
And the jury, in the end, sided with the digital and physical evidence.
They did. They found him guilty by a unanimous verdict on March 27, 2015. And when he sentenced him to life imprisonment, the judge, Tony Hunt, made a very strong statement saying he 110% agreed with the jury's decision. The evidence was so complex and taxing that the jury was actually exempted from future jury duty for 30 years.
So the conviction was secure, and that ended the criminal part of the case. But the story was immediately launched into a whole new, higher legal sphere. The very evidence that made the conviction so solid, that mobile phone metadata, it became the center of a huge legal challenge that went on to redefine data privacy across all of Europe.
This is truly the profound legacy of the Dwyer case. His legal team immediately challenged the admissibility of that crucial mobile phone data. They didn't question the accuracy of the cell site pings, they challenged the legality of how the state got that information in the first place.
So let's define the legal foundation here. What was the Irish law, and what did it force companies to do?
The challenge focused on the Irish Communications Retention of Data Act of 2011. This law was Ireland's implementation of the European Data Retention Directive from 2006. And in simple terms, these laws required telecom companies to indiscriminately collect and hold vast amounts of data, not the content of your calls, but the traffic data. Who called whom, when, where, the cell site pings, for every single user.
For everyone, regardless of whether they were a suspect.
For everyone.
Yeah.
This data was just held for a set period, just in case the police might need it for investigation one day.
So the state was essentially forcing telecoms to be universal archives of everyone's location history. And Dwyer's defense argued this was fundamentally flawed. Why?
They pointed out that the entire legal scaffolding for this was already crumbling in Europe. The European Data Retention Directive itself had been struck down by the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, back in 2014. That was before Dwyer's trial was even over. The ECJ found that forcing companies to keep everyone's data indiscriminately was a violation of fundamental rights to privacy.
So wait, help me understand this. The foundational EU law was ruled illegal in 2014. How could the Irish law, which was based on it, still be valid for a trial in 2015?
That is the core legal controversy. The defense argued that if the superior European law was invalid, then the Irish law, the 2011 Act, was also illegal and unconstitutional, which meant any evidence gathered under it should have been thrown out. Dwyer's challenge eventually worked its way all the way up to the highest court in the European Union, the Court of Justice of the European Union, or the CJEU.
And this shifted the case from murder to an examination of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. What was the central principle the CJEU was looking at?
They focused on two things: proportionality and necessity. EU law recognizes the rights to privacy and protection of personal data, and the court's big issue was with that word indiscriminate. This idea of blanket data retention, keeping everyone's data, innocent people's data, just in case, was seen as a massive overreach. It basically treated every citizen as a potential suspect. In late 2021, an advisor to the CJEU gave a very strong opinion on this. He said that this kind of data retention should be permitted only in the event of a threat to national security, which is a very high bar, and not for general criminal investigation, which is exactly how Dwyer's data was collected.
And when the CJEU finally delivered its ruling in April 2022, what was their conclusion?
They confirmed that strong opinion. They ruled unequivocally that the indiscriminate retention of mobile phone metadata was not consistent with EU law. And this decision was, well, it was devastating for investigative practices across the EU because metadata is crucial for solving so many serious crimes: organized crime, terrorism, and, as we see here, premeditated murder. The ruling essentially said the legal tool that solved the Dwyer case was fundamentally flawed by European rights standards.
That seems like an enormous blow to the state's ability to solve these kinds of complex crimes. What was the immediate fallout in Ireland?
It was immediate and it was serious. The Irish government recognized how big a deal this was, describing it as having potentially serious implications for the investigation of serious crime across Europe. By June 2022, the government was talking about bringing in emergency legislation to try and fix the legal vacuum the CJEU ruling had created.
But for Dwyer's case, the specific question was still there. Even if the law that allowed the data to be collected was now deemed invalid, could the evidence itself still be used in his trial?
Exactly. So the focus shifted back to the Irish courts to interpret that CJEU ruling and apply it to their own rules of evidence. And in March 2023, the Irish Court of Appeal made a decision.
What did they decide?
It was a complex task, but despite that clear CJEU ruling, they dismissed Dwyer's appeal. The court found that while the method of collection might have been a problem under European privacy rights, the data itself wasn't gathered in a way that violated the Irish Constitution, which was the main legal context for the trial.
So they essentially said the evidence was too important to throw out.
That's a good way of putting it. They maintained that the evidence was so crucial and the crime so serious that the Irish court could use its discretion on whether to admit it.
But the final say rested with the Supreme Court, Ireland's Court of Final Appeal. This was the ultimate test of balancing privacy against justice. What did they rule in July 2024?
The Supreme Court upheld the conviction unanimously. They ruled that the mobile phone data was admissible at Dwyer's original trial. It's a very nuanced ruling. They acknowledged that the indiscriminate retention was a serious breach of EU privacy law. However, they made a distinction between the validity of the law and the admissibility of the evidence.
What was that distinction?
They reasoned that the investigators at the time were acting in good faith. They were following a specific Irish law, the 2011 Act. They weren't deliberately violating anyone's rights. So they essentially ruled that while the law itself was retrospectively non-compliant with EU standards, the state had a compelling interest in getting justice for a serious premeditated crime, and the evidence was reliable and vital.
So what does that final Supreme Court decision mean for Graham Dwyer and for the legal system more broadly?
For Graham Dwyer, it means finality. As of July 2024, he had exhausted all his legal options and will continue to serve his life sentence for the murder of Elaine O'Hara.
And for the legal system?
For the legal system, it sets a powerful, if controversial, precedent in Ireland. It suggests that in cases of grave, exceptional crime, where evidence is reliable and crucial, it can be deemed admissible even if the mechanism used to collect it is later ruled illegal by European standards. But the pressure is still on the Irish government to create new, targeted data retention laws that do comply with the CJEU's strict interpretation of privacy rights for any future investigations.
It's truly striking. You have these two completely different types of evidence, the physical evidence exposed by a drought, and the digital evidence almost overturned by a European court. Both played these unique, dramatic, and absolutely essential roles in delivering justice.
The sheer complexity of this case really rests on that contradiction. This was a planned murder designed to look like a suicide, solved by evidence the killer thought was completely gone. And the data that proved his guilt, the cell site pings, led to a legal battle that nearly collapsed the conviction and ended up redefining the privacy rights of every single person across the European continent.
And that really leads us to the crucial point to consider, one that goes far beyond this single horrific crime.
The fundamental issue remains starkly exposed by the Dwyer case. How do modern legal systems truly balance an individual's right to privacy with the state's proven need for that data to solve shocking, violent crimes? When the very evidence used to secure justice is later found to have been obtained under a system that violated fundamental legal rights, what is the long-term cost? The Dwyer case achieved justice for Elaine O'Hara, but at the same time it forced a continental reckoning over where we draw the line between security and privacy in our digital world. And that's a line that continues to shift with every new piece of technology.